welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. I'm Joe, and I'm glad to have you stop by. In this episode, we're going to have a double header. You're not going to want to miss this one. The second one will more than likely give you goosebumps. It's a little bit different. It does involve a Bigfoot, but it involves something else pretty unexplainable. I'd appreciate you hitting that subscribe button for me if you haven't already. And let's jump into the first story. This one comes to us from a guy named Jeremy. This story is based back in 1957. There was several of us who gotten together for the week, going in on a cabin rental near Blind Bay in British Columbia. From this cabin, we looked out over the bay in Copper Island. We'd gone there to catch Kamloops trout? Kamloops, I've never heard of that. If you heard of Kamloops, can you tell me what that is? Down in the comments, which can range in size up to about 20 pounds. This cabin was situated on an elevated parcel of land, so when we were out a fair distance in the bay, we could still see the cabin. At the time, this area was still predominantly wilderness, but evidence of man was starting to show. There was a thriving logging industry and a fair amount of other businesses and things to do in the area. There was a 9-hole golf course and a marina on the lake. We were there in season, and there were some other people around as well. We had a boat with an outboard, and we were going out every day to fish on the lake. It was Tuesday morning, and we were fishing near the shoreline of Copper Island when one of the guys said, "Hey, there's someone over there by the cabin snooping around." Of course, we all turned to look, and sure enough, there was someone dressed in all black walking around the side of the cabin. At the time, we gave it no thought, figuring it was a maintenance guy or something, or the owner checking things out. When we came back in for lunch, nothing seemed to be out of order, and that was that. The following day, we went out for a second round of action in the afternoon and returned with some fish for dinner. My friend Jack filleted everything on the picnic table and came into the cabin with the rest of us to sit and have a beer before we cooked. We were all sitting around inside the cabin with our feet up and having a good time. About an hour or so later, I said that I was going outside to get the grill going. There was a fire pit behind the cabin made of cement blocks with a metal grate on top. The guys were coming out of the cabin, and we were all standing by the pit when Jack said, "Hey, where are the fish?" I said to him, "What do you mean, where are the fish?" He said, "They were all laying here on the table when I left them." As you would well imagine, the whole crew was standing there dumbfounded. Jack had hosed down the table after cleaning the fish and left them lined up on top of it, ready to be cooked. Something or someone had taken the fish from the table while we were inside having a beer. We all started thinking about the guy that we'd seen by the cabin. Maybe he was some local weirdo sneaking around the cabins of visitors looking for stuff to steal. We were scratching our heads and looking around when my buddy said, "Hey, check this out." He was standing next to the picnic table, pointing to the ground. We could see several large prints in the slop that had run off the table when Jack hosed it down. These were not bear tracks, but we had no idea what they actually belonged to. We had several tape measures that we used to size fish, and one of the guys broke one out to measure the prints. One of them was roughly 23 inches long and 9 inches wide. We could see noticeable toe impressions that were wide and well separated from each other in the mud. Whatever this was had been at the table, helping himself to our fish while we were inside the cabin, and it must have been one big SOB, that's for sure. Well, that would give you the heebie-jeebies. A footprint that big, 23 inches, that'd be a monster of a creature. 23 inches, that's an inch off from a 2-foot long foot. If your foot is 2 feet long, how big of a creature you gotta be? That'd have to be 11, 12 foot tall creature. And that thing was just rummaging around while these guys were just inside the cabin. Well, let's jump right into the next story. This one is called The Disappearing Man. This strange and unusual account comes to us by John Murray, a resident of Pennsylvania. He goes on, "My friend Tony and I were rat racing on some fire breaks around a ridge in western Pennsylvania. We had a pair of quads and were tearing it up down this one trail when, as we came around a bend, we saw a Bigfoot crossing the trail ahead of us, about 100 yards or so away. I saw it first and immediately lifted my arm into the air, pointing at it so that Tony would look. Both of us backed off the throttle and slowly made our way up to the point where we'd seen it. There was no mistaking what we'd seen. This thing was huge. It was a fur-covered monster, and it just crossed the trail ahead of us, turning its head right towards us as it did so. When we got where it had crossed, there was somewhat of a trail, but not meant for a quad, so we decided we were going to take a loop around through another break and see if we could see anything more on the other side. By the time we made this maneuver to get on the other side of this section of forest, about 5 minutes had passed, and we were approaching where we believed this Bigfoot must have been heading. Ahead of us, leaning against the tree, was a man wearing nothing but a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and a pair of white canvas boat shoes with no socks. I need to make something very clear before I continue with what I'm about to say. This was early October and late in the day, with the temperatures being in the 40s and windy. The forest was damp, and the trails were somewhat loose and muddied from the rain that morning. The muddy conditions were actually why we were riding that day. As we approached this man, we turned the quads off to BS with him. Immediately I was taken aback by the strong smell of cheap aftershave and hair tonic. His hair was slick and neatly parted on one side, and his jeans were rolled up in a cuff, exposing his ankles. I had a sweatshirt and a jacket and gloves on, while this dude was wearing a t-shirt and sneakers, standing in the middle of nowhere, smoking. I know Tony and I were on the same page about this dude. His appearance was like that of a greaser from the 50s. We told him that we'd just seen a Bigfoot on the lower trail, and we raced up here hoping to see it. Again, he said that he hadn't seen anything. As he stood there, I realized that I couldn't smell the smoke from the cigarette, and it didn't seem to be burning down. Tony asked him if he lived around here, and the guy pointed and said he lived over in that direction. As Tony continued to talk to him, I took note of the fact that his white sneakers had no dirt or mud on them at all, whereas our boots and quads were covered in the crap. These boat sneakers were pure white canvas with no rubber on top, and if he had walked anywhere around here, there would have been mud all over the sides of these things, at the very least. He wasn't really contributing to the conversation, rather just answering our questions as we asked them. I briefly turned my head towards Tony to give a look that signaled what kind of weirdo did we run into. When I turned my head back, the dude was gone. He vanished. No more cheap smelling hair tonic or aftershave. He was quite simply no more. The two of us stood there as if we'd both gone mad or something. Tony started fidgeting with his quad, and I knew why. It was like he and I had to do some type of reality check, feeling the quad's controls and making sure we were still connected to the planet. This event had completely blown our minds. We looked around, but couldn't see any footprints. We started up the quads and went back out the way we came in, eventually approaching the spot where the Bigfoot had crossed, where we had stopped. We were certain of the spot because there was an unmistakable fallen tree by the edge of the trail. As we got off the quads to look around for the tracks, we talked about what happened with this guy. This ground was very soft, but there were no tracks anywhere. We kept checking and rechecking with each other that this was the spot, and we were certain it was. We'd seen this Bigfoot take maybe 3 steps across this very spot and go into the woods, heading in the direction of where we found this disappearing dude. We hadn't stopped to look for tracks earlier, since we were following that thing. The Bigfoot had been huge, covered in fur. Its arms had swung in a cadence with its steps as it crossed, yet there was no single trace that it had done so. To us, this was absolutely the craziest set of circumstances we could imagine. And both of us saw the same thing. It wasn't like one of us was losing our mind. But it happened to the two of us exactly as I described to you. Thinking about it afterwards, the Bigfoot appeared to be gliding, even though it was making walking motions. How a 1,000-pound monster can move through the mud without leaving a trace is beyond me. Well, guys, that one's a little different. You tell me if that doesn't sound a little far-fetched. I mean, I've heard crazier stories. That's not the point. You think this is a true story? You think these guys actually had this encounter? Or do you think this is creative imagination? Let me know what you think in the comments. I greatly appreciate y'all hanging out with me today. I will see y'all in the next one, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for me. If you've had an encounter with a cryptid or any other kind of mysterious creature or anything for that matter, I'd love to hear about it. Throw me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I'll see you in the next one.